First of all, that King Achish really loves David. He's the Philistine king here. Wants him to go with him. He actually gives him a whole division. And who was against that? Well, it was the princesses. Yeah, the princesses of the Philistines didn't want it, so he tells them to go home. Well, David's man is gone. What happens to the city that they live in? Ziklag. Yeah, completely destroyed. What happens to the people that were in the city? Taken captive. Yeah, they were taken captive. So who does David consult about pursuing the Amalekites? He wants some guidance if he should go after them or not. And who does he consult? Yeah, God. Um, so, um, so David comes across this guy in the field, and what does he help him with? And who is he? He was actually an Egyptian. These are kind of hard questions, I know. That there's not a whole lot of information on this. When you read, it's just like 2 or 3 verses. So, when you're reading a bunch of stuff, and this was like back Thursday when you should have read this, so a lot of people forget this stuff. But anyway, David, it's an Egyptian who was a servant of the Amalekites. And this guy helps David find out where the Amalekites are camped. So what was the outcome of this battle? Yeah, everybody, he killed them all except for those that were riding camels. And he recovered a great plunder. Apparently, they had all these battles that they've won, all this plunder from them. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, everybody else was pretty much killed except for those that were on the camel. It's kind of interesting that they mentioned that, too, that little detail. So what did the man who was with David wanted to do with this plunder? Or better yet, what did David want to do with it? It was different than what the man that was helped him in the battle wanted to do with it.
They didn't want to share with some of those that didn't fight that last battle.
Right. Yeah. And what did David want to do with it? Yeah, not only to the man that didn't fight, but to the cities that he went to. All the cities that he that helped him. So that was kind of nice of David to do that. So how did the battle of Saul's army do against the Philistines? Yeah, yeah. And what happens to Saul and Jonathan? Or better yet, how did Saul die? Yeah, yeah. He was wounded by an arrow, and then his armor bearer wouldn't kill him. So he just fell on his own sword to die. So what did the Philistines do to Saul and his 3 sons? Kind of gross here. Yeah, yeah, they hung up the bodies, cut off the heads. So the people of Jabes Gilead, the valiant man of Jabes Gilead, what did they do when they heard about this? Yeah, yeah, burned the bodies and buried them. So we get into 2 Samuel. How does David find out about Saul's death? It's kind of interesting. Yeah, yeah, a guy from the battle comes and tells him about it and stuff. And what did this guy claim he did to Saul?
He killed him.
Right.
He thought he was going to get a reward.
Yeah, what ends up happening to him? Yeah, they kill him.
Angry.
Yeah. He killed by striking the Lord's anointed one, so he kills him. Who was made king over Judah? David. And who was made king over Israel? I like that name, Ishbosheth. It's fun to say. What happened between Abner and Ishbosheth? Abner was his commander, his army.
So Ishbosheth was offended that Abner was going into Saul's lives. He said you shouldn't do that. So Abner just says, okay, fine, David should be king then. Doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And so he goes to David, right? He joins forces with David. And this is kind of sad, too. Who didn't like that? Remember David's commander? That's right, Joab. Yeah, Joab. So what did Joab do behind David's back? Yeah, he killed Abner, right? And so how did David handle Abner's death? Very sorrowful, wasn't he? Ripped his, tore his clothes, gave him a proper burial, wept for him, didn't eat until nightfall. How was Ishbosheth killed?
Murdered in his sleep.
Yeah. Cut off his head and took it to David. And what did David, they should learn this, right?
Yeah.
You would think. So what did David do?
The young men killed him.
Yeah, killed him too. Cut off his hands, his feet, and hung him. And they buried Ishbosheth in the tomb by Abner. So, bonus question. David is going to take care of Jonathan's son the rest of his life. What was the name of Jonathan's son, and what happened to him? Yeah.
Marty, is it your pen? Gotta have that pen. Oh, somebody take my pen, I want it back. Well, even though it was a free pen. I can have 50 pens, but they all gone. If it's bright day, they walk off. So,
I don't know about that.
I got a pen, I watch over.
All right, this morning we're going to cover the parable of the unmerciful servant, Matthew 18. When I was preparing, Amelia came up and she flips my Bible to Jeremiah and she passed it and said, that's where you start this morning. That's where you start. I was like, don't know about that, sister. lesson 7 in the book. All right, so what is our setting here kind of leading into this parable? Does anybody remember what kind of directly precedes this?
Well, that's the place where Jesus is giving them instructions how to deal with a brother who's sinned against him.
Okay, so sin between
Yeah.
between Christians, between brothers. So, kind of how to handle it, and it's really I can appreciate it. It's like a step-by-step guide, and if we don't follow that guide, then we're not following those step-by-step directions, right? And it tells how to try to bring them back into the church, to bring them back into the fold, and it also includes who to include in the discussion, as you go through those various steps and how to handle those, which I can appreciate those things very much. So in this context of sin, going between brothers leads right into this parable where it's set up, and Peter begins by asking what well-known question? How many times must I forgive my brother? And I mean, we all can quote several things that Peter said throughout the Bible, but this is definitely one of those things I think that we all, even rudimentary Bible students, know. How many times must I forgive my brother? And what was Jesus' answer? "70 times 7, which is a curious thing, which Peter in his statement says as many as 7 times. And I actually did not know until I was preparing this and was reading through the author's version of the lesson here, kind of the background behind that number a little bit. I mean, we know 7 kind of comes up in the Bible, but in the context of this, does anybody remember what the author here in the workbook said the rabbis at the time likely taught as kind of the number of times you should forgive somebody? 3 times. So here comes Peter out of the gate. What should I do? Forgive him 7 times? So I thought that was a curious thing. And then as Jesus starts into his parable, I didn't realize that this was going to start with another, therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to, or kind of similar to some of the other ones we studied, the kingdom of heaven is like. So the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. And kind of y'all walk us through, everybody kind of together as a group, let's walk through this. So what was the first thing that happened in this parable? You have who's starting out? Okay, so you got the king there that wants to settle his accounts. So the first person that comes in is the servant who owes 10,000 talents. And then what happened after that he's brought in and asked to pay this 10,000 talents? Okay, so he begged for mercy, was going to suffer the consequences of having that burden but it was also going to then affect his family. His actions were affecting others as well. Okay? And then, how did the king react to that? To that cry for mercy, that he had compassion on, he pitied him, and he forgave him of this debt, right? So, the servant is forgiven, which that's probably, as us reading this, may be enough to celebrate for a lifetime, right? And yet, here we see that the servant goes out, and the servant was obviously some sort of a businessman in some senses, if he owed somebody money and yet was lending money to somebody else, because he went to these other servants, and what did he tell them?
Pay up.
I'm calling it in. But yet, how much did they owe him? A much, much less, much smaller debt. So then you know, his fellow servants are coming into this as not getting the same kind of treatment that he just received, right? And once those servants couldn't pay, how did he react to those servants? Drop the hammer, put them in jail. You're going to pay, or you're going to jail, or whatever, you know, the various consequences that could happen. In this case, thrown in jail. But as soon as the king heard about it, what was his response to the servant he had forgiven? Said, "You wicked servant, I forgave you, and yet you didn't have mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you." And he delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all of his debt. So verse 35 ends in saying, "So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." So, jumping right in here to the questions, did Peter believe that he was being stingy, generous? What do you think he was suggesting when he said, "What should I do? Forgive these people 7 times?" What do y'all think? Sure. Sure. You know, something else I thought about, which I agree with that, Michael, something else I thought about was, I don't know that we see, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that we see in the Old Testament anywhere where it's laid out that you should forgive a certain amount of times, because after all, how did the people in the Old Testament have to ask for forgiveness of sins? By continually sacrificing. And so it's very, to me, it seems very obvious that like there's a continuation of sin. Like it's not just, oh, you get 3 tries for your whole life, and you know you're out after that, buddy boy. No, so it makes me wonder if that was one of these things that was kind of, you know, these Pharisaical type things that they slipped in there and just said, hey, this is the rule we're going to set. I don't know that, but it plays right into what you were talking about, Michael, about, well, if this is what we're, you know, kind of expected, like maybe twice as much. But then, so he probably did think he was being generous by offering that, hey, double plus kind of forgiveness. So when you've got this 7, this kind of double plus thought, then you've got Jesus' answer of 70 times 7, or I guess my ESV says not 7 times, but 77 times. So, how do you think that Peter, in this mindset of this double plus, how do you think that came across to him? Like, how do you think he received that? Not 7, but 77. It certainly, I think baffling was a good word. Like, it probably was something that was hard for him to wrap his mind around. Even though he was already in this probably 2 plus, 2x plus mindset, like, all of a sudden it's like, massive amount of times. So when we get into, obviously I think we all know that Jesus' point to this was, it doesn't matter. And that's not a Jesus issue, that's a us issue. Right? That's a heart issue for us if that becomes an issue. Does anybody know or could count up how many times that Peter was rebuked by Jesus? Like, kind of doing some self-reflection here in this time of, well, how many times should I forgive him? 7 times? But does anybody recall, or could you count up how many times Jesus had rebuked Peter? Just that one-on-one interaction. I don't have a specific number myself because yeah, and then, at least in my mind, you mentioned it, but it also comes up again when he does deny him the 3rd time. What happens? He turns and looks at him. To me, that's another. It doubles up a little bit, but it is another instance. Yep, that's true. So there's 7. That's around 7 times. That physical earth. So did everybody hear? Did y'all hear Michael's statement over here of what it was? What example did the Jews have of that unlimited forgiveness like we see from Jesus? That's essentially what your question was. I don't think in a physical sense that they did have that, person to person. Can anybody recall anything in the Old Testament that they had that example of sure enough person to person forgiveness like that? The one
I don't know if the word forgiveness is used, and I don't know where the passage is, but there's instructions in, it's either Exodus or Leviticus about you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Do not be bitter in your heart towards you brother. There's some restitution type stuff making it right there, but not being bitter in your heart towards your brother. I can't remember exactly
Yeah.
where that is, but that really is at the heart of forgiveness, is to get rid of that bitterness.
sure.
There's also David. I mean, how we've been studying here. How many times did Saul try to kill him? And then in the end, it was still he sang Saul's funeral song, and it was just like
He was still sad.
he was. I mean, there was no bitterness against Jonathan or Saul or Abner, anybody who had chased him for years and years and years, who had displaced all of his family and hunted down everything that he loved. David still forgave.
That's a good point, Melissa.
That just struck me with the words he used to describe Saul, and then later on, I think it's Ishbosheth. Like, they were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions, they were this, they were that. I like all of this beautiful praise, and it's like love covers a multitude of sins, I guess.
Sure.
That was amazing, really. I don't know if we have another example of a human being really not holding something against another. And Joseph,
Yeah, Joseph. See, that's why I like we can brainstorm together here. When Amelia's telling me I need to go to Jeremiah, it's hard for me to think about all this sometimes. I agree with that. I think these are all good examples of the physical side, and the reason I said I don't know that there's a physical thing is I think about they obviously didn't have very much self-reflection on themselves as a people, because from day one, how many times has God had to forgive them as their people? I mean, as we read through the Judge, it's been a while since I studied Judges till we read through it, and it's just like, what are these people doing? But this is continual all the way through the Old Testament, forgiveness for those that wanted it. So that was the only thing I could come up with. But good call out, Michael.
But number 7 comes in when they forgave debts. Every 7 years.
Yep.
They were, not like the word last year, they were
Re- Yeah, it's like the year of Jubilee kind of concept. I forget if Jubilee was every 7 or if it was but it was, yes, there was a forgiveness aspect to that 7th year for that redemption and that wipe away the debts and all of those things around
I
that.
think
So
there's your physical that is what you're looking for, kind of. In
That's
the
prob-
old law, because technically
that's probably
that's
true.
what forgiveness is. It is the cancellation of debt.
that is true.
In a metaphorical sense.
word that I don't know if it's the right word, but I think about in a lot of those situations is pride. Like they let that pride get in the way of themselves. Like I'm not gonna let go of that, you know, versus just saying whatever, man. Like, you know, it's I've had a lot more forgiven of me than what you know this is owed. So, okay, question 4. In terms of this repayments amount, does anybody have a grasp on what these amounts kind of are? I know this has been studied before, and I know different. It's a little bit loosey-goosey, but the big terms, big picture perspective is still there. Does anybody have any kind of idea on this? What these amounts are? I know in the lesson he gives you all these numbers, and I was like, I'm not dealing with all these shekels and 30 million shekels and whatever.
What I understand, a talent is like roughly a year's work, I think.
Yeah.
If you make anybody, so 10,000 would be like, you're either filthy rich if you got that amount of money, or like you're living many lifetimes.
So my ESV has a footnote that says a talent was a monetary unit worth about 20 years of wages for a labor. But now, I mean, it's a thing. It's loosey-goosey.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you're talking about, at a minimum, let's say 20 lifetimes of debt. Like,
There you go.
okay, that's laughable, isn't it?
He's got to calculate.
Yeah, he's calculating over there.
Or are you a human calculator? There you go.
Versus the debt that he goes to his fellow servant and asks him to pay is about what? 300, not denari. Denari, I think we kind of all have generally thought that a denarius was about a day's wage, I think, throughout time. That's kind of, so, okay, a year's worth of labor. I mean, how many of us owe at least that much money? I know I sure do. So, you know, very realistic thing versus Michael's calculation of 165,000 years. $6 billion in today's money. Yeah, you could be off a little bit, but either way, it's a boatload of money. So again, there's this comparison of there's no way this guy could ever pay this versus this little bitty, more or less nominal amount that is just could just be an everyday amount of money that they owe somebody because of something that they've come up with. So very significant difference in that. And when the king heard about this, he sends him to different versions word different ways. ESV says, send him to master deliver him to the jailers. I think some other versions have some little bit darker language. Does anybody have one of those versions that's a little bit darker language in verse 34? New King James is of tortures, which I could say, I mean, they could be the same thing depending on, especially in this period of time. So this idea of was he cruel or unjust for sending the servant to the torturers? What do y'all think on that? Like, what's your heart saying about the king's reaction to this servant that he forgave, but the servant didn't forgive? Sure. Okay. I think that that's a fair thought process, but I think at the end of the day, focusing on the parable itself, we, me, we are that person you just described, right? Like we've done all these criminal things in the eyes of the law, and that shows us what we deserve. And the book asks what message was this of sin if he didn't, if there was some alternative, or I guess whether he did or did not, like, hey, you're going to suffer the consequences, or the other alternative is there is no, it doesn't matter what you do. And that's clearly not going to be the case, right? Because he lays it out there, and he doesn't cut him any slack after he runs into this. All right, let's see. How is torture of eternal punishment described in the Bible? We'll go through these last couple pretty quick because we're running out of time. What are some words that y'all think of that you've read in the Bible that describe eternal punishment? Weeping and gnashing of teeth, where the worm never dies. So something so fragile. I mean, you can just pinch it and but yet it's never going to die. The lake of fire, the brimstone. What is it, Liz? Outer darkness. Like all of these things that are very scary if you really sit back and think about them. So I didn't full disclosure try to find this in any other versions, but in verse 35 of the ESV, I cannot answer this question. So I was hoping somebody else could. Does anybody else have verse 35, what this should say based on the question in the book? From the heart? Is that what it is? So that we must forgive others from the... Yeah, that makes sense. We must forgive others. Oh, I see there. It does say from your heart in here, but it just wasn't worded the same.
Yeah, the way the questions are from a particular translation.
Correct. Yeah, okay. So that makes more sense. Thank you, Miss Shawn.
Because I was going to say, your trespasses, because the way it's worded in
So,
Bible version.
forgiving them from the heart.
Yeah.
And we can see how the king, how he had to do that, right? Like if he forgave him, there had to be the heart had to be involved there. He was moved with compassion. Okay. So for us, personal question, what sins might be committed against us that would be difficult to forgive? And think about this in terms of brother on brother, brother on sister, sister on sister, like us in this room. Because that's what the context is here, coming out of the paragraph right before. What are some of the things that would be very difficult for us to forgive? If y'all don't speak up, I got buzzed on your seat, I'm going to start shocking you. Because I know that there's angry words. Okay. Yes, sir.
I think one of the hardest things for people to forgive is when someone else does something ill towards their family, like their child.
Okay.
Their child does something, anything like that.
Okay. Some ill will type thing. What else?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Speak bad about your family behind your back or something, talk bad.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, and I think that in general, we have all probably seen within the church as a whole, bigger picture, times where words, ill will, maybe pride that has to do with all of these things can send us down a bad road, right? I think every one of us, if we step back and honestly say we've seen that happen, and I think that's probably more prevalent in the church today than the things that are more physical things like where it's a true altercation between people, or something like an affair or some kind of sexual misconduct. Those physical things, like, we don't often see as much as these non-physical, non-tangible things. And I think a lot of times, I know for me, and from what I've perceived, I can't judge this from other people, but from what I've perceived, it seems like pride can get in the way of the forgiveness of those things. And pride probably sometimes led to the offense of those things as well. All right, bell's going to ring on us shortly. If someone committed multiple sins against us, would we still be required to forgive them? Or committed a sin multiple times against us, would we still be required to forgive them? The answer is yes. That doesn't mean that we have to be, depending on what the nature of it is, we don't have to be ignorant to the fact that this has happened and put any protections or whatever kind of, in place, I think. And something I guess we'll end on is, when would God make an exception and not require us to forgive someone that has sinned against us? I don't honestly know that I have an answer to this question. Like, I just wanted to pose it. It was in the book. I thought it was an interesting question, but I don't know that there is a time, unless it has something to do with, I don't even know, something to do with against God. So that goes back to what we talked about earlier. I think like, we still have to forgive them, but you still have to put protections in place. So you can. Oh, wow! Thank y'all for your time and for your participation.